Welcome, my friend, to Next Level Change Success, a change conversation for leaders, project and change practitioners for today and tomorrow. My name is Therese Perez of myvirtualchangemanager.com, and I'm an experienced change and project professional and people leader with many years of experience in the industry. I love business, and I love the people side of business especially. So nothing lights me up more than seeing people use change management, project management, and strong change leadership to engage, motivate, and inspire people, and ultimately transform organizations. If you've heard about change management and have no idea of what it involves, then you're in the right place. If you know about change management, but you want to take your practices to the next level, then this is where you should be. I'm going to share the stories of my experiences, interview some fantastic people, and I'm going to explore all of the challenges and opportunities that you face in organizations right now. So please join me and let's go and have some fun. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Next Level Change Success. My name is Therese Perez and I am the founder of myvirtualchangemanager.com. Welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm recording on Tharawal country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians on the land on which I am recording. And today, on this chilly, not quite winter evening, but it certainly is chilly, that's for sure. You can tell winter's just around the corner. I'm talking about change when it comes to policy and process change. Now, it's interesting because not many people understand the concept of policy and how it works if you haven't worked on a change that's policy oriented. This can often happen in a highly regulated environment. So if you're working for government, but if you're also working in obviously people and culture, there's oftentimes HR policies, people policies, organizational policies that are there that exist to tell you about the guidelines of that organization, the ways of working of the organization, the stance that the organization has in regards to certain things. So if you're working in an organization currently and you're not across their policies, I suggest that you do become aware because it is important. Now, oftentimes there are policies that can line up with legislation or external regulation, and then internal policies need to change if something happens externally as well. Cyber policies, things like that. So policy change is possibly more frequent than people believe or understand. And that's oftentimes because people don't really know the policies in an organization when they work for them. And I have to say, I was one of those people who had gone a lot of my career without really addressing any sort of policy change. Had others who developed policy, but I was more interested in tech change, process change, not really the policy side. But then I came across some amazing policy makers who strategically consulted really well with community, with organizations, within the organization itself when looking at developing or changing policy. And those who consult really well, I think, end up with the best end product. But you'll know that I talk a lot about that in relation to change and the fact that you do need to consult. You need to sit with people. You need to understand the problem, certainly long enough that you're putting the right solutions into place and that you understand the impacts of changing policy. And across the globe, I think there's no difference in approach there. The best policymakers are those who sit with the people who it will impact, consult, discuss, collaborate, co-design policy change, and also understand the implications of policy changes as well. And if you're changing legislation, obviously a lot of that should be consulted upon and factored in. So from a change perspective, when you come into an organization, when you're looking at, it might be something to change with the system, but you also need, or an IT system, but you do need to explore whether there are any policy changes that need to take place as a result of even tech change that might be happening. So you kind of need to explore all of the different areas. One of the biggest things that I find with policy change is that if it's strategic policy that's being brought in, a lot of the times it's hard to operationalize if there hasn't been that real thorough exploration and research about the implications of putting that policy into place. So it is important that if you're coming in and being the receiver of a strategic policy change, that you do then explore what processes are impacted, who are the customers or clients or community members who are impacted as a result of that, who do you need to consult with. Oftentimes or sometimes those individuals have been consulted in the policy development, sometimes not so much, and so you need to explore that. Then look at what procedures and processes need to change. Sometimes you find that there aren't any existing procedures or guidelines that can be changed, and so you need to develop them and make sure that they are trained in. And I have to say there's a huge amount of times that policies have been effective in organizations and almost thrown over the fence, and yet none of the work around changing processes or updating processes or any procedures or any guidelines exist, and you're kind of playing catch up. So don't be surprised if you're working on a change just like that. It's like everything was needed yesterday. And when you talk to people, it's kind of amusing because they talk about, well, the board's already signed this off. Well, that's great, but they signed it off 2 months ago and no one's actually implementing or following the policy because it hasn't been communicated, the processes haven't been changed, or the processes don't exist. They haven't been led by leaders, and oftentimes leaders are so critical in these changes because the leaders are the ones who will be reinforcing the new process and holding their teams to account under the new policy framework. So a whole raft of change activities do need to happen so that people are aware of the change, people are adhering to it and actually implementing that policy. So there can be some major, major disconnects in organisations when board members are going and signing off policies with no implementation plan that they're across, and then everyone's playing catch up when people realise that the policy hasn't been implemented. So it's almost similar to, we talked about strategy, and sometimes when strategies aren't actually implemented well. And so in this aspect, when it comes to policy, this can also happen too. So when you're looking at policy, you need to look at the IT systems, if the systems need to change to implement and reinforce the policy. If there are IT systems or processes that you can tangibly change, this is how you embed the policy the best, is actually translating what the intent was into the practical solutions and guidelines and frameworks that individuals use on a day-to-day basis. So linking the policy and the intent in the policy is really important. One of the biggest things that people will be challenged by is that policy does not go into detail. Oftentimes it talks about guidelines, intent, but it doesn't go into every single scenario. And so it is good to explore with the policymaker the different scenarios to ensure that the stance is consistent, because people will always have questions about the application of the policy. And because there isn't that level of detail, you do want to make sure that there is the right intent behind the decisions that are made in line with that policy. No one likes to play in the grey. It is very, very difficult for people to be too autonomous in that space. However, there may be certain levels who are able to make decisions, and they should be supported with certain guidelines around further clarity around policy process, so that it is making sure that the implementation of it is as effective as possible and in line with the intent. So a few things there around really wanting to make sure that people are clear and around the intent of the policy, how it can be applied, how it shouldn't be applied. And just like in some of the change communications that you do have with people who are impacted about saying, this is what has changed, but this is what remains the same, policymakers can also contribute to that type of communication around the intent of the policy, and this is what remains the same as the intent, but this was the variation that we considered when it came to making the changes in the policy and why. That helps communicate the why is really, really important, because then people can understand the intent even more. And sure, there might be some grey around it, but I'm pretty sure that most policymakers have a clear intent as they go and form through changes, so that they can tighten policy or that they can get different outcomes as a result of that policy change. Processes link really closely to this, which is why I want to kind of put both of them together around policy and process change, because oftentimes they are interrelated. And even with processes, there's oftentimes an intent behind a process change, not just efficiency and streamlining, but there may be a more of a strategic reason why there might be changes in, let's say, excess levels if you're working in insurance. So there may be a reason why there's been a policy change in insurance around what you're going to pay and what you're not going to pay. And I think sometimes this is also from an industry perspective. Insurance is at the core. Every insurance person who holds insurance has a policy. Some of the changes that are made in that policy document, there's an intent behind it. There's a lot of discussion currently happening in Australia about changes to policy and premiums related to all of the natural disasters happening and what will be covered and what won't be covered. Now, there's a clear intent from the insurance organisations around what they will and won't cover, and a lot of it has to do with obviously the cost of repairs, the economic climate that we're in, but also climate change and what's happening. So insurance policymakers are really starting to review things in light of that. Now, those policy changes have clear intent. It's to protect the interest, obviously, of the insurance company, but also to try and be fair to the consumer and the policyholder. Make sure that they're kind of weighing that up around their obligations as an insurer, but also make sure that the coverage is sufficient, but not going to send the insurer to the wall. So any policy change, people need to understand. They need to understand the intent so they can communicate it to the customer, to the client. As you go through that, then there will be differences in the systems, there'll be differences in calculations, there'll be things that the customer service people would need to know. And as part of making sure the change is effective is from top down, they're really going to need to know that. Now, it's really interesting around some of the policy changes I've worked on in my career. I do talk about that one of my early career roles was in relation to communicating the introduction of the goods and services tax in Australia, which was a long, long time ago now. Yet at the time, it was quite controversial to move and have a tax that essentially the government was implementing. And I worked for an insurance organisation at that point in time. And so it was very much a real challenge around making sure that everyone understood what was going on around the increase in premiums, because we were adding 10%, which was the goods and services tax. So there had to be clear communication in relation to that. The customer service people at the time really needed to know how to answer the inquiries that each of the individuals would be receiving from policyholders because their premiums were going up. And to essentially say that it wasn't money that the insurance agency was going to essentially have in their own coffers, but they were needing to give that to the government, that it was a government tax. And so very controversial at the time, really important. Now, change as a discipline didn't even exist then, but from a marketing and communications perspective, which I was working in, it was so key to make sure that everyone knew about this and everyone knew how to talk to the goods and services tax. And because it was such a strange calculation, or not necessarily an easy calculation to talk to people about. You'd think 10% on top of things would be easy, right? But it was very, very controversial, and it was in the media so much that there was a lot of speculation about it. There was a lot of misunderstanding about it. And so we really needed to make sure that everyone was across it. Of course, we sent out communications, but people wanted to talk to people. They also wanted to almost object to getting this increase in their premiums. It's no different now, except for the fact that insurance companies, because of the climate change and other things, are needing to put their premiums up, change their policies. The injustice of it still feels a little bit like that at the moment around the ever-increasing costs of living, and so this just seems to compound it. So, few things to think about when it comes to policy and process change. I always say make sure you scope the whole change. So it's not just about the policy or the process change. Are there systems that need to change? Are there skill sets or capabilities that people need to have that they didn't have before that you need to factor in and train them up on it? Making sure that they're comfortable to answer questions and become the experts in the change itself. making sure then, of course, that the leaders are on board, that they are leading their teams and explaining to their teams what is happening, why it's happening is really important, so that teams can then explain it to the customer. Now, sometimes policy changes can fall in the benefit of the customer way. I think that does happen, absolutely. And I think sometimes that is a really good news story. So they're kind of the easier changes for people in the customer service area to embrace and understand and get on board with, because they feel like they won't get yelled at down the phone. But certainly, probably most would be in a restrictive context or a change that someone is going to be a little bit disadvantaged by. And no one likes to lose anything when it comes to change. So those type of visceral reactions can come down that phone line pretty hard and fast when it comes to changes on policy. So you do want to also make sure that whilst you're training people in the capability space, you also want to make sure they have the support and the space to be able to handle objections and handle those well. So just remember, it's not just about technical capability, it's also about the capability to be able to respond to emotional calls. It's also being able to handle and, from a mental health perspective, feel safe around being able to take the calls that some people may have from disgruntled customers, or have a triage and a team who are specialised in that, so that if there are any escalations, that people can handle them, or a specialist team can handle them. Do consider that in your change plan if you find that the policy isn't one that's really all that favourable for customers or for existing customers. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you are working on policy and process change and you have more questions, you want to talk about tactics or anything like that, certainly come to myvirtualchangemanager.com. We have a lot of tools available, we have assessments available, we have courses available that you may want to dive into to brush up on your change skills. And just remember that change matters because your people matter. Have a great day.